Hello, everybody. My name is Andreas Gailus, and I'm the chair of the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures here at the University of Michigan. I'm happy to welcome you all. Invisible though you are, it's very strange to speak to a group of people you don't see. Very happy to welcome you for what is bound to be an exciting event. And at last count, close to 400 of you are participating, which is really an incredible number. We're really happy to have you all here, whatever here means. So this is the second event in a series the Department of German Studies is co-organizing this winter with the Center for European Studies. The first being a conversation between Professor Tiffany Florville and my colleague Kira Thurman on contemporary Black Germany that took place about a month ago. Today's conversation is called Learning from Memory, and it asks what we can learn from comparing different memory cultures. Like the event on contemporary Black Germany a month ago, today's conversation is not just on Germany and Europe, but also on what happens when German and European debates are brought into dialogue with similar debates in the US. This is very much the kind of interdisciplinary and transnational work we are doing here in the department at the University of Michigan too. And I invite you to have a look at our faculty websites to get a sense of the scope of the scholarship that is being done in our department. Today's event is entitled Grilk Conversations in honor of Werner Grilk, who was an active member of our department from 1962 to 1992 as both an important scholar and beloved teacher and mentor, and who remained an active member of our community since his death in 2016, not least as a regular attendee of the event we are hosting today. Before COVID, this event took the form of annual Grilk lectures given by prominent scholars working in the areas of German philosophy, literature, art, and politics, such as Martin Jay, Peter Gordon, and Andreas Hüssen, to name just a few. Given the need to move this event online, we decided to change the format and turn the lectures into conversations between important intellectuals whose work engages issues of great contemporary relevance on both sides of the Atlantic. My colleague, Johannes von Moltke, will introduce our two guests, but let me just say that I'm absolutely thrilled that Susan Neiman and Michael Rothberg agreed to join us today. When Johannes and I first discussed the idea of a Grilk conversation on memory culture, these two scholars, these two names immediately emerged as our dream team. So I'm truly happy to welcome you today. My only regret about today's event is that we won't be able to have dinner afterwards. And that's a huge regret. All right, so the conversation will last altogether 90 minutes, including these comments. So we will stop at 3:30 Michigan time. And it will be moderated, as I mentioned, by my colleague, Johannes von Moltke. A prominent film scholar and expert on the Frankfurt School, Johannes has published extensively on topics ranging from early film theory to the genre of the Heimat film, and from Siegfried Krakauer's American writings to, most recently, right-wing media cultures. Johannes will briefly introduce our speakers, and then after some initial statements by each of them, moderate the conversation, which will last about 50 minutes. We have reserved the last 20 minutes or so for an open Q&A with you. I'll ask you to put your questions into the Q&A, and Johannes will then pull them and read them out aloud. So with that, I'm handing over to Johannes.
Thank you, Andreas. And let me add my welcome to everybody. First of all, and most of all, to Michael Rothberg in LA, good morning, and to Susan Neiman in Berlin, good evening, and everybody in between. We're glad that you're here. As Andreas said, I want to give some brief introductions. I'm sure many of you who tuned in know our two speakers, but I want to just recapitulate very briefly some of their bios, and then give a short framing explanation of what we had in mind in inviting Susan and Michael together, after which I'm hoping we can, as Andreas said, frame this as a fairly open and free-flowing conversation. You're also welcome to start using the Q&A at any point. So if you have burning questions that based on reading an article or a book, you can already put them in, but we'll take, and then I'll try to sort through them later. So don't put too many in. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, Susan Neiman studied philosophy at Harvard and the Freie Universität Berlin, finishing her PhD under the direction of John Rawls and Stanley Cavell. She was assistant and associate professor at Yale and associate professor at Tel Aviv University before becoming the director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, where she is now. She's a member of the Berlin-Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaft and the American Philosophical Society. Susan is the author of over 100 essays and 8 books, translated into many languages, among which I'll note just 3, not the languages, but the books, for reasons that will hopefully become evident over the course of our conversation. First, her dissertation, which was published by Oxford University Press in 1994 under the title, The Unity of Reason, Rereading Kant. In other words, devoted very much to understanding reason in the Enlightenment. Second, even before that book, Susan published Slow Fire, Jewish Notes from Berlin. And most recently, of course, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil, published by Farrar Straus Giroux in 2019 and recently translated into German. Michael Rothberg is the 1939 Society Samuel Getz Chair in Holocaust Studies and Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. He taught previously at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where he chaired the Department of English and directed the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory, as well as the Initiative in Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. His work has been published in such journals as American Literary History, Critical Inquiry, Cultural Critique, History and Memory, New German Critique, and PMLA, and it too has been translated into many languages. He has co-edited multiple volumes and special issues on memory and post-coloniality, and is the author of 3 monographs ranging from Traumatic Realism, The Demands of Holocaust Representation in 2000, to his latest book, The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, which came out from Stanford 2 years ago now, right? In 2019, I believe. He's also the author, of course, of Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization. The publication of a German translation earlier this year has catalyzed a spiraling debate about which I hope we'll be able to talk in our conversation today. For that conversation, I think it's also important to mention a project that's still in progress and that Michael Rothberg is pursuing together with Yasemin Yildiz. That project is devoted to what they call Migrant Archives of Holocaust Remembrance and deals with immigration and Holocaust memory in contemporary Germany. So welcome back to both of you to the University of Michigan, such as we are. It's great to see you both, and we're obviously delighted to have you both join us in a conversation that was prompted by 3 related impulses. First, our sense of the thematic overlap between your works. Second, our perception, and we can talk about this, of shared theoretical assumptions. And third, the specificity of the German context for your work and its reception, which I'll qualify in ways later, but that seemed relevant to us when we thought of coordinating this event. So let me say something briefly about those 3 areas of overlap to kind of ground our conversation. First, it seems obvious that your work and publications, both past and present, share an interest and have shaped debates, very importantly, on memory and identity, on comparison and multidirectionality, on anti-Semitism and racism. For all the differences between your disciplinary backgrounds and subjects, readers of your work won't be able to help but notice certain shared archives, so to speak. Your texts have common touchstones and thinkers such as Hannah Arendt and W.E.B. Du Bois, in shared lieux de mémoire such as the Washington Mall, the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, in major public conversations such as the historians' debate of the 1980s in Germany, debates about reparations, or the recent Mbembe affair and its ongoing reverberations, not to mention Israel, Palestine, South Africa, and the US civil rights movement, past and present. Second, Your work seems animated by shared convictions in the malleability of memory, the fact that while memory deals with the past, its time is always the present. Similarly, each in your own way, you've done much to assert the importance of comparison as such, and that's hopefully one of our topics today. Michael has argued, indeed, that when it comes to memory, comparison is unavoidable. And I quote from something Michael has written: memories never exist in the singular. Comparison, analogy, appropriation, and echoing are unavoidable components of all articulations of memory. Consequently, both of you assert the importance of comparison, the need for a form of comparative thinking that, like memory itself, is not afraid to traverse sacrosanct articulations, sacrosanct borders of ethnicity and era. That's again a quote from Michael's work. At the same time, you've both expended considerable effort on specifying the difference between comparison and equation. Both of you know full well that, as Susan puts it in Learning from the Germans, no two histories are ever entirely alike, and that comparative projects therefore need to take dissimilarity for granted, as Michael puts it. The question is just, how is the comparison performed and to what ends? What insights can it yield and for whom? Those are also some of the questions I hope we'll broach today. A third impulse, as I said, for this conversation stems from the fact that your work has been taken up in specific ways in Germany and in the US, where two important books of yours have appeared in German translation over the past year. Von den Deutschen lernen came out in March 2020, and Multidirektionale Erinnerung came out just over a month ago. Both books have been widely reviewed in the media, from the FAZ to the Taz, in Die Zeit and Der Spiegel, and on national radio. Susan has been working and living in and commenting on Germany for years. Michael, whose work is more, if I can put it that way, francophone in inspiration, has become something of an expert, not just based on the research project that I mentioned earlier, together with Yasmin Yildiz, but also in the whirlwind of the past few weeks and the debates that have sprung up around Multidirektionale Erinnerung. So we'll certainly get into some of these questions of the specifics of your respective works' reception, but I first wanted to give you and the audience the chance to recapitulate some of your key arguments in your own terms, so that we can be sure to base our conversation not only on the waves that the work has generated in the media, but also on the actual contributions that you've made, especially since some of the waves that have been generated are, happening completely irregardless and unconnected to the contributions that you've made. So if we could start with you, Susan. As you write in your book, Learning from the Germans, the title claim raised some eyebrows. In fact, you note that during the 3 years in which you were working on Learning from the Germans, and I'm quoting, most every German I know rejected the comparison between the crimes of the Nazis and those of American racists. And you note that many Americans, though not all, and particularly not Southern Black Americans, also reject the comparison. The book is then, as you say, an argument with these critics, a defense of the comparison. So I was hoping that you could briefly recapitulate that argument for us here.
Yes, let me just correct slightly what I wrote in November 2018 when I turned in the manuscript. I thought the comparison would be extremely provocative to Americans. Indeed, an NEH fellowship, for which I was told I was a shoo-in for all the jury, got rejected precisely because it was tendentious to compare those two events. It's okay, I managed to take a sabbatical and do the research I wanted to do in the Deep South, but it was striking. When I came back, when the book came out in America in 2019, and my publisher had organized a really very extensive book tour across the country, not one single person objected to the comparison. And I think that's thanks, if you can say that, to Donald Trump. I think probably Charlottesville was a dividing line in which Americans realized Nazis are not just a German problem, and people were extremely glad to hear what they could learn from them. In Germany, however, I know of people who said they would never open a book with that title, which to some extent confirms my thesis that it belongs to, being a decent German of a certain liberal centrist, actually probably CDU even, means seeing yourself as part of a Täternation from which no one could possibly learn. So let me just recapitulate the thesis. I have to say I am going to write a long essay, which I think will be called What I've Learned from the Germans Since I Wrote Learning from the Germans. Really largely because of the controversies that Michael and I have differently been involved in, but they're basically about the same thing. But I still maintain my primary thesis. It is not a whitewash of German Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, which some people assume because of the title. On the contrary, it begins by describing how very slow, how very difficult, how very unwilling the process was for American readers and for English and Dutch readers. That's where it's come out so far. The thing that was the most shocking in the book was that for 40 years, West Germans in particular saw themselves as the worst victims of the war. It's not something that gets talked about, but what really interested me in doing the research was, reading between lines and then also actually reading books from the 40s and 50s that most people don't read anymore. The tropes that West Germans in particular used to describe themselves in the 40s and 50s and into the 60s were exactly like the tropes that defenders of the lost cause use. We lost the war, 7 million people, our men were in POW camps, if they even survived, or wounded, we were hungry. And on top of that, the damn Yankees blamed us for starting the war. Now, they didn't call them the damn Yankees, they called them the Amis, but it is the same sense of victimization. And nevertheless, the Germans managed to do something historically unique. That is, we would all like to see ourselves and our people as heroic. When that becomes impossible, we tend to see them as victims. No one else has ever, no other country has ever traversed the space from hero to victim to perpetrator. And, what I have to say to German critics who tell me, it was too little and too late, is you invented the concept of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. How in the world could you expect to do it perfectly? And if you don't acknowledge that some progress has been made, and I have lived in Berlin since 1982 with one longish break in the 90s. So I have seen in my own life the changes that have been made, which led me in 1988 to decide I did not want to raise a child in Berlin. To 12 years later, 12 years and the red-green government later, I must say, deciding, no, I will come back to Berlin. So those are very real changes. And in order to separate, in order to improve on what's already been gained in this move from victim to perpetrator, you need to at least acknowledge that there has been made progress in order to make more. And, you have this whole anti-Deutsch movement and people, we're the Täternation and there's nothing that we can do about it, basically. And I just find that a politically, first of all, I think it's historically false. It tends to be made by very young people, sometimes people who are writing as if it were still 1984, but I was here in 1984. And I see the vast differences in what it means to be a Jew and what it means to be a foreigner then and now. Okay, one has to recognize that, and recognize in particular, when I began this book, I began it on what I date as the beginning of the American Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, which was in June 2015 when President Obama gave that incredible speech at the funeral of the 9 churchgoers murdered in Charleston. And he was the first national figure ever to say, if we do not acknowledge and face the violence of the past, we will continue to have more violence in the future. And I think that speech was as historic and perhaps even more than Weizsäcker's famous speech in 1985. It really opened something up. And of course, we know that the Trump movement was a backlash to the fact that, a Black family had lived for 8 years in the White House and done it basically superbly. But, it's still the case that a beginning was made there. And that was a moment, in fact, sitting right here watching President Obama, I thought, hey, they're finally beginning a Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. This is something I know something about and could make a contribution to. And we've seen, of course, over the past 5 years, with everything from the National Lynching Memorial to the discussions over monuments to the 1619 Project, we've seen this wave, which is now a Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, and sometimes I think has some of the same failures of the German Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. The US is way ahead of Britain on that score. The Brits, there was a poll exactly a year ago in which only 19% of British citizens said they saw anything wrong with the empire, Now, I think Black Lives Matter changed that, and you're now having a discussion in Britain as well. But again, if you compare the timing of those movements to what happened in Germany, there is still something to be learned from the Germans. I would now argue, in view of the past year, controversies that Michael and I both have been involved with, one could also learn from their mistakes. But I think I'll stop there and let Michael describe.
Maybe I could just follow up on one question, since we'll be talking about it, on the issue of the pointedness of the comparison. So learning from the Germans, overspecifies in a way that there's something, and that led to the misunderstandings or the critiques, that there's something glorious to be learned and applied simply. And I've been struck by, in reading your book, by the way you deploy comparison as a heuristic, as a way of expanding the imagination. And what I found particularly arresting is that you use it very like as a pretty sharp instrument. So you say, when you're in, I think it's at one point when you're in the American South, you ask yourself, what would it mean if the same kind of police violence that we see in the US against Blacks every day were still possible against Jews every day on the police? And then I think the phrase that you use is, again, my imagination failed me. Mm-hmm. So the comparison becomes like a test of the imagination that allows you to also unlearn certain things, break up certain patterns of thought. Is that a description that does justice to your work?
Yeah, that's very nice. I like that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could say more about the comparison if you like, but maybe Michael should have a go.
Okay. Yeah, we'll come back to it.
What I find so interesting, and why I'm so glad you arranged this conversation, Johannes, you said we came, I think you said something like similar theoretical assumptions. Actually, we come from completely different theoretical assumptions. Michael says very clearly he was most strongly influenced by post-colonial theory. I have a lot of problems with post-colonial theory. And I also think it's important that we come from different regional and personal backgrounds. But I'll say some more about that later. But in fact, we do share practically every conviction. I don't think we disagree substantively on anything, which is really interesting. At least in my reading of your work, I keep saying, yeah, that's right, good.
That's kind of a challenge to the moderator to find the disagreement. So, but let's give Michael a chance to weigh in on this. It struck me in trying to. Sorry for the mashup, right? Learning from memory is learning from the Germans, and multi-directional memory just mashed together. So, but it struck me that if Susan is prompted by looking from a current German vantage point across the Atlantic and ask, what can we learn from the Germans, that in a way, Michael, your work started out in the other direction by crossing the Atlantic with W.E.B. Du Bois, visiting the Warsaw Ghetto, and after the war. And you describe that as really the conceptual inspiration for multidirectional memory, which was just translated. So I'm wondering whether you could briefly recapitulate for us the constellation that you saw crystallized in Du Bois's encounter with the Warsaw ruins, and how that allowed you to counter what you call competitive memory cultures with the idea of multidirectional memory.
Great, thanks. Yeah, first of all, thank you, Johannes and Andreas, for this invitation. It's so wonderful to be here, and it's nice to meet Susan actually for the first time. And I've read her book with great admiration, and I agree with a lot of what Susan just said, that we arrive at very similar positions from very different starting points. And maybe we can come back, and she's already put a lot on the table, but let me go through a little bit the genesis of my own thinking, and then come back to some of those comparative questions. So yeah, indeed, when I started work on multidirectional memory, what I was interested in at the time was taking what I saw as a somewhat nation-bound discussion of what we called like the Black Jewish question, and trying to look at it from a more transnational and comparative perspective. And so Du Bois was really interesting for that. And as I started to think about that question in a transnational way, it led me to think about the way that different memories of historical trauma and suffering interact in the public sphere. And what I observed, and this was now more than 20 years ago, was that there was a kind of consensus, both in the public sphere and I think among a lot of scholars as well, about the way that memory works. And there was an idea there, and I think it's still very much with us, that memories are owned by groups and are a kind of property, and that they are pitted against each other. These different group memories are pitted against each other in a kind of winner-take-all struggle. And that's what I called competitive memory. And now, of course, competition and conflict are indeed very real in the field of memory, but in other fields as well. And of course, people have deep attachments to group memories as well as individual memories. I don't deny that. But what I thought was mistaken, and what I still think is mistaken, is the idea that these conflicts, these competitions, happen according to the logic of the zero-sum game, as I came to see it, and that group memories can somehow be cordoned off from each other, right, into discrete entities. So according to this zero-sum logic of competitive memory, as I describe it in my book, too much memory, and this has been a very common kind of discourse, and it remains so. Too much Holocaust memory was seen to crowd out memory of slavery and colonialism, or vice versa. For those who were concerned about the status of Holocaust memory, too much discussion, too much memory of slavery or colonialism was seen to relativize, to crowd out, and even potentially to deny the singularity of the Holocaust. And my argument is that memory doesn't work that way. Certainly there are zero-sum struggles over some sorts of resources. I just don't think memory is really one of them. So even conflictual and competitive articulations of memory, in my argument, produce more memory and not less. So a lot of these debates that we're having right now are precisely an example of that. You defend the singularity of the Holocaust against the memory of colonialism. What you actually do is generate a whole discussion around colonialism. So for me, memory works in this productive, associative, and dialogic way. And that's what I call multidirectionality or multidirectional memory. when I discovered this essay by Du Bois, I did not yet have this vocabulary of multidirectional memory, but I think in retrospect, it was the first moment in thinking in those terms, or one of the first moments in thinking of those terms. So I discovered this short essay he wrote called The Negro and the Warsaw Ghetto. It was published in 1952 in a Jewish communist magazine called Jewish Life, and it recounted a trip that, among other things, a trip that Du Bois had made in 1949 to Warsaw, during which he visited the ruins of the ghetto, right, which had been completely reduced to rubble during the Second World War. Though at that point, he also was able to see the Nathan Rappaport memorial to the ghetto uprising, which had been erected in the previous year, I believe. But basically what he saw was a kind of vision of complete, absolute destruction. And what really struck me was at this moment, so we're talking late 40s, early 50s, when very few people had a sense of the specificity of the Holocaust, right, among the various forms of Nazi atrocity, which was the sort of the language that was being used back then, Du Bois actually came to a vision in which he perceived in this destruction of Warsaw and of the Warsaw Ghetto something about the specificity of the Holocaust. And yet at the same time, he perceived its connections to his own history and to his own thinking. And so he said that not only did I see what I saw in the ghetto was not equal to anything I'd seen before, he also says, I came to see that my own experience was no longer separate and unique. I could no longer understand my own experience of racism as separate and unique. And so it's this vision of, on the one hand, not collapsing different histories into each other, right? They are not equal in his terms, but also not fetishizing their separateness and singularity, seeing them rather as relational, right, not separate and unique. That to me became a kind of ideal or ethical version of multidirectionality, right? To be able to perceive similarities, but also differences, to hold those together, and to do it in the name of a kind of solidarity of different victim groups. And so for me, that was very powerful. Du Bois makes those connections, I would say, through the category of race, right? For him, that's the thing that allows him to bring together these two otherwise very different histories, as I think he would say, as I think all of us would say. These are not the same histories. In other parts of multidirectional memory, I find other kind of transfer points between the Holocaust and other histories. And as I continued to research the book, what became especially important was the era of the Algerian War of Independence in France. Johannes mentioned the sort of Francophone angle of my work earlier, and certainly in multidirectional memory, that's true. And I knew nothing about this before I started working on multidirectional memory. It was really a kind of accidental discovery. And what I found was that, again, in a moment in France when there really wasn't a sense of the specificity of the Holocaust, a kind of specificity of the Holocaust started to emerge precisely in a kind of dialogue with what was unfolding in the Algerian War. And there, it wasn't so much race, though that did come up at certain moments, but rather it was things like torture. Think of Jean Améry's famous essay on torture, and think of the torture that the French were doing in sort of mass production of torture during the war. It was camps. There were concentration camps in which Algerians were being held. And there was the importance of bearing witness to those things, both to torture and to the camps, among other forms of violence, that provided these kinds of multi-directional transfer points, I guess I would call them, that allowed people who themselves had lived under the Nazi occupation and perhaps fought against the Nazi occupation and perhaps were deported by the Nazis only 15 years earlier. They perceived similarities, right? They perceived similarities. And my argument is that it's the perception of those similarities that actually started to bring the Holocaust more into public conversation at the very same moment these fierce debates about the independence war were going on. So I think I'll stop there for now. Hopefully that gives a sense.
Yeah, so the question that I've been dying to ask you, Michael, since I read Multidirectional Memory, and I do think this has to do with regional differences. Growing up in the South, the memories between Blacks and Jews were so multi-directional that they went all the way back to slavery times. I mean, African Americans identified with the children of Israel in Egypt, and Jews identified back That is 30% of all the white people who went down to the South when white people were still getting killed were Jews, and were 2% of the population. So I grew up with this multi-directionality. And of course, you know as well as I do that some of the solidarity was ruptured. I think both sides made mistakes in the late 60s and the 70s. But the fact that it's still alive and well won us the Senate in January. And it's not just that Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, one happened to be a Black man and the other happened to be a Jew. They campaigned together referencing the solidarity between Blacks and Jews during the civil rights movement that is practiced. It wasn't just for campaign purposes. I mean, Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was Martin Luther King's church, and the Temple, where I happened to grow up in. So I followed the Georgia elections really closely. They have been practicing that kind of multi-directional memory, certainly since Martin Luther King's days. And, I thought maybe, before the Senate election, I would have thought maybe that's all gone, maybe nobody remembers it anymore. And in fact, when I was in Mississippi, it was really interesting to talk to African Americans who immediately, sort of recognized that Jews were not ordinary white people, and that was not just older people who remembered the civil rights movement. I remember a conversation that I had with a young Black student activist, very smart young woman from the South. We were talking about cultural appropriation, and which is a problematic discussion anyway, and I think we don't have time for it. But one thing she said to me stuck. She said, well, it would be cultural appropriation for white people to sing gospels and spirituals. But you're a Jew, you had the Holocaust. It's okay for you. So it's just interesting that there is at least a part of the country in which the multi-directional memory is still very strong.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's something that you thought about, but it's also, Du Bois, but Robeson, Albert Einstein.
Sure. Yeah, no. Yeah, the way I work as a kind of this could be partly a disciplinary thing, I don't know, but as a literary critic, I tend to hone in on specific examples and try to, this Du Bois piece is very short. It's a few pages long, right? But I try to get a lot out of it. And in some ways, that's what we do. We close read, we contextualize, and we draw out a certain, logic or argument. In any case, that's the way I often work. But of course, without idealizing it, and I think we might want to go into some of the contradictions and complications of this tradition as well, ultimately, of course, that tradition, that sort of Black Jewish tradition of solidarity and activism is one that inspires me, and that I find personally very, very powerful. Absolutely. And it's also, that's another example of what I mean when I say that memories are not owned by groups, that they're not kind of exclusive property, right? Because think about the importance of Exodus, right, in the Black tradition on the one hand, but I do think, and that's very well known, of course, but I do think it goes both ways, as you say. And I think, for example, there's a really beautiful passage that I discuss from the Polish-French Jewish writer Andrzej Schwarz-Bart, where he talks about the importance of slavery for him. And it's both going back to, Exodus on the one hand, but also the transatlantic slave trade, and it's also the Holocaust, and it's his encounter with West Indians in Paris in the 1950s. And it's this really completely woven together, very multi-directional sensibility that Schwarz-Bart has. And so, yes, I think you see this kind of exchange, and not just between Blacks and Jews, of course, but that is a powerful node of sort of intersection. All of that said, I would still, of course, want to draw out some of the asymmetries. And I do think that as Jews in the United States, we are still white people, right? And we benefit from a lot of those, the privileges that come with that. And I think we have a sensitivity to questions of race and to a kind of minority status, but I think it's also important for us to recognize, what comes with the sort of the white skin that we also have.
I entirely agree with you about that. It would be hard to deny. But I think one of the differences between the really violent and hostile reception your book has gotten in Germany, has to do with a very limited knowledge of what that means. One of the nicest things for me about the reception of my book in the States is the number of Jewish institutions and Holocaust museums and Holocaust research centers after the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the summer. The number who invited me to give lectures or be the scholarly consultant on their exhibits. That is I agree with you that we are at this stage of the game much more privileged than African Americans. But the fact that so many Jewish groups felt compelled to do something officially and institutionally, and I'm not really, I'm not talking about left-wing groups, I'm talking about pretty centrist groups, felt compelled to do something, right, is important.
Including in collaboration with, in the case of the one that you did close by, even though it was virtual, right, too, but it was a collaboration between the Museum for African American History in Detroit and the Jewish Community Center in Farmington Hills, I believe. So it's really interesting that we've wound up here and that you asked that question, Susan, because I was thinking about this in preparation for this, in part in terms of Michael's point about the nation boundedness of the Black-Jewish relationship. So one of the stories you tell that I found completely arresting is that of a young PhD student, Susan tells, of a young PhD, not young at the time, but a PhD, a woman who got her PhD from the University of Michigan with a dissertation on Jewish women in the South, Jennifer Stolman. And you describe how she goes to a Jewish community center to report about her work and is roundly attacked because essentially, in Michael's terms, she's bringing memory competition into the game, that there is a relationship, an implication also, to quote Michael's recent book, an implicated subject of that Jewish women and Jews were implicated in slavery. And there's a kind of fierce resistance against that in her community center. And she says it was like 10 years of education in one night just to see that. So on the one hand, go ahead.
I mean, there are two really clear traditions in Jewish thought. And the one is a tribalist tradition and the other is a universalist tradition. And because I'm thinking about these questions right now, I actually asked a very learned rabbi recently, does textual analysis help us? Supposedly there are 4 authors, they've identified 4 authors of the scripture. And can we make any sense of the fact it's Pesach for anybody who's celebrating Chag Sameach right now? In the story of the Exodus, on the one hand, you get this message, you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and you therefore have an obligation to take care of the strangers among you. And on the other hand, Amalek, they always try to kill us. Watch out for the others, So you have these 2 strands, and I asked my rabbi, is there textual analysis that would say one of the strands was more? And he said, forget it. He said, there's been a civil war between the Jewish people going on forever. And both of those traditions are quite real. And it's good that Michael and I are in the universalist tradition. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. I mean, I'm happy if the 2 of you talk, but since we're on this issue now, the question of universalism, that is something that I find remarkable about both of your works. And I completely take your point that you come from different theoretical places, but let me try one more way of suggesting a similarity, and that is that that you both write from an awareness of the importance of the particular. Including your own particular positionalities. I'm struck by the way both of you emphasize at various stages and in different voices and with different intentions, your own position writing as American Jews. Michael even voices at some point some kind of reticence about putting himself out there, but then he does it. And you make it explicit, and I think, Susan, you make it explicit. Lots of moments in your descriptions how you went about researching the book. And yet you both work, I think, toward a horizon of universality, but it's differently anchored. So Susan wants to argue from a position of enlightenment and towards a universal, and you end the book on a kind of repudiation of tribalism, behind which it's hard not to hear identity politics. So that's on Susan's side. On Michael's side, you wouldn't use the term enlightenment. There's the post-colonial critique that comes in between, but you also have a universalizing tendency to say, what I'm aiming for is an ethics, is a form of solidarity, right? So that encompasses, that crosses ethnic lines, that crosses kind of protected realms, and that identities are not, memories are not owned, right? So there's a sense of trying to spread beyond this. So I'd love to hear you both talk from the perspective of your work about debates around identity and memory, or identity politics and memory cultures.
I think it's Michael's turn.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think what you just described is right. I mean, it feels right to me, both in terms of where we overlap and maybe where we differ. I'm totally open and like the idea of a kind of horizon of universality. And certainly what I'm interested in is a movement toward it. I guess what I'm not sure of is whether we can presuppose it or if we're already there. So to me, it's a kind of work in progress that needs to be constructed. And it's always going to be constructed from particular positions, or at least, let's say, it's important to acknowledge that we're constructing it from particular positions. So I think that this is certainly a place where Susan and I come at it from different angles and probably have real intellectual differences, but I think politically then we end up in the same place. So again, it's a kind of it's a bit of a mystery, but I think that's to me, it's a good sign also that you can actually end up with a certain overlap and agreement, and at least create a space in which to discuss these things, which will come maybe more to the reception is so hard in certain circles. But for me, identity is not the opposite, I suppose, of universality. And I think I'm not going to be able to quote it correctly, but in my chapter on Aimé Césaire, I think he articulates it nicely, that what I'm interested in, what he's interested in, is a kind of cosmopolitanism with flesh, I think is what he calls it, or at least he's against a cosmopolitanism without flesh. And then I say, well, therefore, a cosmopolitanism with flesh, which I think means bringing in our identities and various multiplicities, etc. I'm not an essentialist about identity at all, obviously. But I do think that a lot of the assertions of identity that get tarred as identity politics today, it's always the ones that are coming from various minoritarian positions, right? It's the ones that are shut out of the allegedly universal, neutral discussion. And this is very much true in Germany, and I think it's true in the US today. And so, I'm very wary about criticizing identity politics because I think there's so much misunderstanding about it. And because I actually think certain kinds of assertions of particularity and positionality are an important part of the construction of a more universal public sphere, a more universal politics, a politics based on solidarity. And for me, solidarity is most significant when it is precisely solidarity across identitarian boundaries, right? Not fixed boundaries, but across differences. And so I didn't actually have this in multidirectional memory itself. I developed it afterwards, but I came to this notion, and Du Bois is really, again, for me, a great example of differentiated solidarity. Right. It's that we're able to create bridges, we're able to create bonds, we're able to work together, to think together, to struggle together, across and through the acknowledgement of our differentiated positions.
Thanks. Susan.
Yeah, I don't think I would agree with anything you said, Michael, which gives me some hope for, because yes, we do share the same political position, but it gives you some hope for maybe reconciling some of the theoretical battles between the people who influenced you and the place where I'm coming from, you know, which is very decidedly from the Enlightenment and also from the conviction. For me, a big problem with post-colonial theory is that it misreads the Enlightenment. I mean, the Enlightenment, and there are plenty of people, or some people who've written about this, they were the first anti-colonialists. And once again, if they didn't get everything right, they still provided, for me, the foundations for an anti-colonialist position. I like the word horizon a lot, which Johannes brought in. That's also, by the way, a Kantian trope, you know, that you're moving towards something that you probably don't ever reach, but that's okay because it gives you a direction. And I mean, I also like the phrase cosmopolitanism with flesh too. One of the reasons that I wrote the book the way that I did, which is partly in the first person, to situate myself and to describe the way that I was going around, you know, the way that I was understanding things, but also very much by interviewing other people, because I wanted precisely concrete voices with particular backgrounds and particular histories. So I think those things are tremendously important and continue to think so. I worry, I don't even use the word identity politics anymore because it's become so toxic. It's just a word that's used by the right. And of course, the right never talks about white identity politics, which are the biggest, most, you know, powerful forms of identity politics. And we've seen that not just in the US, but all over in the European right. So that word has been, you can't use it anymore. But I do find that some of the discussions that I have problems with really essentialize identity, as if everybody only had one identity and it's an ethnic identity, and you know, that's where you're situated. So that's the kind of thing that troubles me in some of these discussions. But well, you know, someday when when the pandemic is over, we have to have a long conversation about maybe how we can bring together these two very different theoretical backgrounds that we're coming from, because actually we do converge on practically everything.
Very interesting. Not what I thought we were going to be discussing, but I think that's a very interesting point. Let me pivot a little bit, because I do think before we go to the Q&A, we should say something about the German framework and the German specificity of this and the reception of both of your work in Germany. And I want to preface it by saying that, again, I'm drawn to both of your work for its particularity, for its interest in, as Michael was saying, the inner workings of texts, the contradictory logics you find, but also in Susan's work, the careful reconstruction of scenarios with which to think. And even if it's just interview situations or your own memories of them, it's really fascinating. And you know, so one of the scenarios that stood out for me in your work, Susan, was when you described Samuel Schiedam, an Israeli Druze working at the topography of terror, the memory, kind of central memory site of Nazi atrocity, educating new Syrian refugees about the Holocaust. So it's a changing Germany that we're talking about. That's the first thing I want to say, which is also what I take to be the object of Michael's and Yasemin's work on migrant archives of memory. And yet, there seems to be a vehemence to the reaction, particularly to Michael's work, but also to the work around the initiative for Weltoffenheit, world openness, that Susan helped launch in Germany, in response to, we can't reconstruct the whole scenario here, but some critiques around the work of Achille Mbembe. I want to note that there's something really head-spinning about some of the reviews that your books have received. So just to preface this part of the conversation. In more cases than one, the reviewers fault Susan and Michael for not saying precisely what they do say and for saying precisely what they don't say. So in A Funhouse of Mirrors, Michael is accused of relativizing the Holocaust and advancing a notion of competitive memory, which you've just heard him argue against. And Susan is taken to task for failing to provide the qualifiers and nuance that can be found on every single page of her book. So I just want to lay that out there before I say I want to also give you a chance to respond to your critics, because on one level, one shouldn't dignify them with a response because they haven't done the work to get involved in the conversation. But on another level, I think it's important because it says something, as you were saying, Susan, earlier, it says something about Germany right now, that there seems to be this need, this almost visceral need to respond, to insist on the singularity of the Holocaust, to re-provincialize, as Michael argued in an article in the Zeit this week. So Susan, I'll try to make this two questions about the reception of your work, but then we can end maybe on a conversation about that. To Susan, some of the critiques sound a lot like the ones you heard while you were writing the book and which you'd set out to counter. So I'm wondering whether you feel like you've been able to sway some of the less stubborn readers, and how you've experienced the response and to what degree the intervening debates have affected your thinking about the book. And here I'm also thinking about, the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protest in Germany, which is a new level of intersecting where the book does comparison, right? The book really has Germany and the US and then has this heuristic and comparison, but it seems there are lots of places where there is actually intersectionality or multidirectionality going on. So the BLM movement seems an opportunity to think about that. So my question is, have you had occasion to rethink some of your work in response to the responses?
Yeah, I have. I mean, to answer one of the questions you asked, I have actually convinced some people. The most controversial chapter of the book in Germany was the chapter about East Germany, in which I argued that for the first 40 years, at any rate, East Germany did a much better job on dealing with the Nazi past, even though it instrumentalized it, and it also didn't do a perfect job. And that drives West Germans mad. The Aussies love it. I have to say, I have gotten so many thanks from former East Germans who say, finally someone is trying to tell a reasonable, non-contemptuous story of what our anti-fascism was like. But I have also convinced some Vetsies. So that was really nice. People who said they were, not prepared to be convinced, but that they were. I'll tell you what's changed, and this segues into also it connects my discussion of East Germany with some of the debates that are going on now. I have been complaining for years, and I did in the book, to Germans. Hey, what about the Historikerstreit? Because the Historikerstreit supposedly established in 1986 and 1987 a consensus, and it was not a consensus, it was a singularity, but let's locate it historically. You do not compare Nazi Germany and the Stalinist Soviet Union, okay? We weren't even talking about the DDR. We were just talking about the Stalinist Soviet Union, whose crimes by 1987 were pretty well known in the West, okay? And nevertheless, the consensus fell on, Habermas's side, which was, you don't do this. Now, there's a reason you don't do it, because all of those attempts to compare German Nazi crimes with other crimes were basically attempts to evade responsibility and to exculpate themselves. And we don't even have to talk about Ernst Nolte. We can go back, if anybody bothered. I never read all of Mein Kampf, but it's clear that in Mein Kampf, he uses European Americans' genocide and theft of Native American peoples and lands to justify you know, the movement toward the East. And Carl Schmitt, who for reasons that continue to escape me, is read and taken seriously by many people on the left. Carl Schmitt writes in 1942, he writes a critique of British and American colonialism. And of course, he's absolutely right. But is he writing because he cares about liberation? No, he's writing to say they did it, and we can therefore, you know, seek our Lebensraum all the way to Vladivostok. So the comparisons were in a very particular context. And I understand that Germans are therefore allergic to the comparisons unless they involve communists. And the thing is, 5 years after the Historikerstreit, everybody or many people began referring to die zwei deutsche Diktaturen, which drives me nuts, particularly since it wasn't even a reference to the Stalin Soviet Union. It was talking about the DDR. So I find it really significant, and you can see this all over the place. I mean, there are monuments to the victims of the Zwei Deutsche Diktaturen and so on and so on. I find it really interesting that Michael's work is being attacked because he's allegedly questioning the sacred status of the Holocaust, when in fact, this comparison has been going on since roughly shortly after 1989. Michael, if you want to use that in a debate, you're welcome to. I think it's really shocking that suddenly, because we're talking about colonialization and people of color,
Right.
there's a problem with comparison.
And I should clarify that for those who aren't following the debates as obsessively as I have for the last 2 weeks at least, that there is a kind of emerging moniker for the reception of essentially of Michael's work as the launcher of Historians Debate 2.0, that we are now redoing the Historians Debate. So
I've also been compared with Nolte, by the way. Just
welcome to the team. Welcome to the team.
Another commonality. So so Michael, I think let me just pitch it to you then. You know, like, how do you've been very busy trying to respond to your critics, and why don't you just take it from here?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll say it's, you know, on the one hand, what scholars' dream is not to get the kind of attention that my book has been getting in the German public, in newspapers and magazines. And it's fascinating that, you know, I think multidirectional memory has certainly been very well received, or at least quite a bit received in the scholarly community in the United States, and also in other parts of the world, including Europe and including Germany before the translation, but never generated any kind of public discussion of this sort whatsoever. And so it appears in Germany, and all of a sudden it gets this very public discussion, but it's based on misreadings and misunderstandings, or non-readings, really, in a lot of cases, by people who just don't seem to have actually gotten very far into the book. Mm-hmm. You can kind of tell who read how much of the book, or who just read the, you know, interview or read about it or what have you. That's a bit discouraging. I do think it says something. I do think it's symptomatic, and in that sense important, not because it's about my book, but I think it says something about the German model of coming to terms with the past. And I do, you know, I really admire Susan's book, and I mean that very sincerely, and I agree with, you know, almost everything in it. But I do think, on the one hand, things have started to shift in the last few years since she was writing it, and we can talk about why. I also think that I would probably see the origins of some of the problems we're seeing now going back a little further. And it's because I started to pick up on this. Yasmin Yildiz and I spent a year in Germany, 2008, 2009. And we started to pick up on some of these discussions around anti-Semitism in migrant and Muslim communities, for example, and the way that the Holocaust was starting to be used as a kind of disciplinary tool to discipline migrants, and especially Muslim, so-called Muslim immigrants. And that itself is a problematic term for a lot of people. So to me, you know, and that's what sort of motivated our project on migration and Holocaust memory, was we started to notice that there was a strange and kind of disturbing discourse, which was sort of a racializing discourse that was being used around immigrants, that in which accusations of anti-Semitism, and claims about the Holocaust and Holocaust memory were being used to, again, sort of discipline migrant and minority figures. And so, and I do see what's happening today, and I would go back, not just the last couple of weeks, certainly, but certainly since the Mbembe debate broke out now almost a year ago. That to me seems to be a sort of period, which I think you then have to trace back probably to the Bundestag resolution adopting in some quasi non-legal way the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism as a kind of, again, I don't quite know what to call it, as a kind of consensus view within Germany. And so since 2019, when that happened, now it's really accusations of anti-Semitism. There's been a real pickup in the use of accusations of anti-Semitism to discipline. Again, you have to notice people of color, people from outside of Germany, people on the left, people in solidarity with Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. And so I guess, I feel like we're at a point where something has to change, something has to give. And what makes me hopeful is that I know there are a lot of people in Germany who are precisely looking for alternative visions, like the kinds that I think that Susan and I offer in our work, like the kind that is offered in the initiative on Weltoffenheit, and that there are a lot of sort of grassroots initiatives, but also initiatives coming from fairly powerful places, like the Weltoffenheit one is. There's a desire for a change in the discourse. And so, people are very dug in. I think our opponents, if you will, are very dug into their positions. I think what I would agree with Susan has been a remarkable and unique history of coming to terms with the past and making this move through the positions hero, victim, perpetrator, as she said. I think it is a remarkable history. I do think it's sort of unique, but I think it has become a kind of dogmatism. And that dogmatism is having very, very deleterious effects in all sorts of quarters and in terms of debates, in terms of politics. And so I think a lot is at stake, I guess, in these discussions about comparison. And therefore, I'm sort of glad to be part of them and to try to intervene from my perspective outside of Germany, as I obviously acknowledge, but with personal connections to Germany and having spent a fair amount of time there, not as much as Susan, of course, but over the past 20 years, having spent a fair amount of time in Germany and understanding pretty well how things work there, I guess, to a degree.
But it seems like, that's the whole point that we're discussing, is deprovincializing German memory culture. Absolutely. And, I think it's remarkable to me that, that was your argument in the article in the Zeit this week. That's also the argument of the Initiative Weltoffenheit, both of which are about opening, as is learning from the Germans, opening the lens so that the discussion can be had in a newly configured public sphere, really.
Yeah. And I think I was going to say, Susan's book, obviously from its title on, though it's obviously much more nuanced when you get into it, it was very much about Americans learning from both the failures and successes of Germany. And I think we still have a lot to learn in the US. Yeah. It's by no means, something has changed, as Susan was saying earlier, perhaps in 2015. A lot of important things have been going on, but there's been a lot of backlash and a lot of backward movement also in recent times as well. So we're still learning. We still have things to learn from the German case, but I think also the Germans have things to learn from others as well. And that's the new point that I think is important to insist on.
Well, absolutely. I said at the beginning of this conversation, I will write a long piece about what I've learned from the Germans since publishing Learning from the Germans. In view of this debate, let me just make a couple of points in response to Michael's. First of all, they're not just using Holocaust memory against people of color, they're using it against Jews. And Israelis.
100%.
Including Michael.
Including Michael.
And Susan. I don't know if you saw Felix Klein's attack on me recently.
Oh, I didn't.
Yeah, look it up.
I will.
Ava Manasseh wrote a very good reply, however, so but still it's quite extraordinary that the descendants of the Nazis think that they can tell Jews and Israelis when they're being anti-Semitic And but I'm even more surprised by the number of Germans, and this ranges from an AfD politician who was trying to recruit me with Islamophobia, to really very educated, German intellectuals, cultural functionaries, whatever, who are surprised to learn that there are differences of opinion in the Jewish community. I mean, this is the first Jewish joke you learn, right? It's there are two Jews, three opinions. But this is a piece of news for a huge part of the German public, who takes, on the one hand, on the one hand, they idolize Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt and spend lots of money celebrating them. But on the other hand, they get their views of what Jews think from the Central Council of Jews in Germany and/or from Benjamin Netanyahu, whose son is a poster boy for the AfD. Now, the other thing to say, Michael, is this is part of an international problem, and it may have started first under Trump. We know, at least most of us know, well, first of all, the number of anti-Semitic incidents, including violence and murder, skyrocketed during Trump's term. We know how many anti-Semitic remarks and tropes he made. And nevertheless, he seemed to think that by embracing Netanyahu, although, as even he himself pointed out, the Jews didn't thank him for it. It was the Christian evangelicals who thanked him for it. By embracing Netanyahu, he could wash his own deep racism and anti-Semitism clean. This is going on in Hungary, it's going on in Poland, it's going on all over the place. So the fact that it's going on in Germany right now doesn't surprise me terribly, except that for Germans, there's a little extra twist. And you're absolutely right about the dogmatization of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, particularly since it's gone along with a lack of understanding, well, first, many things, but one of Jews. That is, Germans know one thing about Jews. We murdered them. It was awful. And I think the trauma of knowing that is actually one of the things that gets in the way of actually engaging with real Jews or Jewish culture or Jewish history. But the other thing is, the last thing I'll say is, I think this is, and I made very clear in the book, that a major failure of German Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung was its complete ignoring of what happened in East Germany. East Germany was accused of being anti-Semitic after reunification because it didn't prioritize the Holocaust. It remembered the Holocaust. There were 1,000 films made about the Holocaust when Germans were still watching Heimatfilme and waiting for Hollywood to bring over Holocaust on television. But they also talked about racism. They talked about the 14 million Slavic civilians who were murdered. And this is not to say that they weren't also racist. Of course they were. This is a long process of working yourself out of it. But the ideology was not, Nazi ideology is reduced to anti-Semitism. It's racist and nationalist. And it seems to me that if we could get that piece of post-war German history back, we'd be in better shape.
Great, thanks. I'm going to again pivot and allow other voices to come in so that we can just let more people participate. And I'm gonna, there's a slew of questions, so I'm sorry I'm not going to get to all of them, and I don't know, because I can't do 3 things at once, that I'm going to pick exactly the ones that I should. But here's one that's short enough, and also I think to both of you, it's directed to Susan, asking whether you've read Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and how you see it in terms of parallels with your own work in learning from the Germans. But I would pose the same question to Michael. I mean, do you see that the India, Germany, US comparison as a multi-directional comparison? Does it work for you? Does it, does it not? We don't have to spend a long time on it, but I wanted to give each of you a chance to just say something briefly.
I'll just say up front that unfortunately I've read a lot about it, but I haven't yet had a chance to read the book itself. So I should reserve judgment.
Yeah.
I have read it, and I have to say I was disappointed by it. I loved Wilkerson's first book, so I was very much looking forward to this one. I don't think that she did the kind of granular research that would make for a more interesting multi-directional comparison. I've had a number of South Asian scholars say that to me about her discussion of India, and I would have to say that about her discussion of Germany. So I was disappointed.
I'm going to try to combine some questions, because it seems there's a real interest among the audience about answering the question, what's changed in Germany? There seem to be different versions of that question. So maybe I'll just read through three of them that jumped out to me. Michael Atzman, who's a colleague here at Michigan, says in the early 1970s, only people at the very fringe would have expressed publicly views such as Noethe's. What changed in the subsequent decade and a half? Was it just that the memory of trauma of World War II and the Holocaust had faded? Peter McIsaac, another colleague here, asks, both speakers have made reference to things having changed in Germany in the past few years. I was wondering if they could each say more about what has changed in this regard. And then I saw that Jonathan Skolnick says more specifically, since 1989, an aging and dwindling Jewish community in Germany has been revitalized, mostly through immigration from the former Soviet Union. There are now over 100,000 Jews who make their lives in Germany. Has this changed the dynamics of World War II Holocaust memory in Germany today, and how? So those are three versions of the question of what's changed.
The 100,000 are only people who officially joined the Jewish community, which is an official act. It's also, you get taxed for it, but moreover, it's a very conservative community. So estimates are that it's more than twice as many. And they include not only people from the former Soviet Union, but on some estimates, 40,000 Israelis, lots of Americans, lots of Brits. So it's actually quite a vital, it's the largest, fastest expanding Jewish community in Europe. It has not, unfortunately, really changed the memory discourse. And that's part of what this initiative, Weltoffenheit, was discussing. It was by no means only about Achille Mbembe. He was sort of the last straw, or the next to the last straw, because there have been lots of cases since then of Israeli artists whose work gets defunded because they're critical of Zionism. So it is my hope, because I am meeting lots of interesting Jews, especially in their 30s, really interesting Jews in Germany, in their 30s or very early 40s. My hope is to help encourage them to speak out and actually change this, change the discourse. And interestingly enough, there are some who say Neukölln, which is an area in Berlin where I happen to live. I live on the northern edge of it. Neukölln is the place where the Israelis and Palestinians can most often meet without problems. So let's hope. I don't know, Michael, you want to take the other ones?
Yeah, I mean, that's all. I mean, I would confirm some of that, and I can maybe add to that a little bit. I mean, first, in terms of the overall question of what's changed, I mean, I obviously, I think we're all still trying to figure that out. I do think, as Susan said earlier, that this is not unique to Germany. And I mean, there are similar debates, or whatever you want to call them, going on in France, for example, around the whole Islamo-Gauchism thing. I think in the US, we have some similar things too, with critiques of people working on questions of race and identity, et cetera, et cetera. So there is something very international and sometimes even almost seemingly coordinated about some of these campaigns. That one without being conspiratorial, there's certainly a kind of synchronization of a kind of right-wing discourse around, I would say, I hate to say it, but post-colonial studies, identity politics, Islam, et cetera, et cetera. I think some of it at least has to do with an attempt to preserve the speaking position of, I'll say it, white Christian Germans or white Europeans at a moment when more people of color are starting to speak out and to be visible and to be active in the cultural sphere, in journalism, in the political sphere, what have you. And I do think that's what a lot of this is about. It's about a kind of battening down of the hatches and holding on to that kind of dominant majoritarian identity. And I do think, to pick up on Jonathan Skolnick's question, that I can't say what's changed, and I haven't done any kind of ethnographic study, so this is more anecdotal. The Jewish community in Germany seems to me incredibly diverse and incredibly interesting. Susan's already made the point that there's no singular Jewish perspective on anything. I just want to make that clear. I certainly don't speak for all Jews or any Jews other than myself on a good day. But I'm in touch with a lot of very interesting Jews in Germany. Most of them are not German Jews. Some of them are Israeli Jews. Some of them are American Jews. But they're people who have set up camp in Berlin, especially, and have roots there now, and are doing really exciting things. Artists, especially. And to go back to the kind of ongoing project that I have with Yasemin Yildiz, one of the things that's really struck us over the years, again, going back now more than a decade that we've been thinking about this, is how much collaboration there precisely is among the younger people, I think, as Susan said, maybe people in their 30s, across lines of identity. So Jews in Germany working together with post-migrants and other people of color. Turkish Germans has been one of our particular interests. And we saw that especially at the Ballhaus Nauninstrasse under Shermin Langhoff's direction before she moved to the Gorki. And I think you see it again at the Gorki. It's an incredibly, in the German terms, bunt kind of diverse and interesting and exciting intellectual and cultural space that has been created. And, I think these are the people, among the people who want to change in the discourse, who are rebelling against the rigidified, dogmatized forms that Holocaust memory has unfortunately come to take. And nobody is calling for the forgetting of the Holocaust, the taking away of German responsibility for the Holocaust. Nobody is doing that among these kinds of people. What people are calling for is a more diverse culture of memory that recognizes that the Holocaust is not the only crime that needs to be remembered, that German colonialism remains underworked through, to use the kinds of terms that Susan uses, and that racism in the present is an important and urgent issue that needs to be tackled as well. And that also has something to do with these debates about anti-Semitism and Holocaust memory. We have to be able to link those things to what's happening in the present, not because they're the same. They're not the same. Obviously, nobody is saying that either, but because they have to do with the memory and the legacies and with questions of what it means to be German, I think. I think a lot of it has to do with that.
So I would agree with you on once again, I agree with you about everything. I just like to add two things. I mean, never again as a slogan, it's almost a tautology that it cannot only apply to the Holocaust. I think it was David Reef who said never again cannot mean never again can Germans kill Jews in concentration camps in Poland. Note, I did not say Polish concentration camps. To go to
That's
that.
a question in the Q&A too.
Another important issue.
Yeah.
But I agree with you that part of the reason this is an international project, and by the way, they are connected. The radical right, unfortunately, is much better networked among themselves than the left. I wish it weren't the case, but I won't say anything more about that. I agree with you that it's about fear of other white fear of voices of people of color or women. But what's particularly perfidious about it is using the Holocaust as a way, as a, I'm going, oh God, I'm going to quote somebody else again, but it's really in a different context, a moral club, not to beat the German people with.
Uh-oh.
No, but come on, it is used that way. Not to say anything good about Walzer, but to say it is being used as a moral club. Damn it, I'll just say it. To intimidate people who want to talk about other crimes that have been committed, that need to be faced, that need to be dealt with. And that's why I think your work is important, Michael, and I'm glad that it's caused so much debate.
So I don't want to put you on the spot for things that you haven't read, and you can always just beg off. But since you were moving in the direction of the Gorky Theater, there's a question by Götz Saciak asking about Max Czolek and the concept of desintegriert euch. And Gegenwärtsbewältigung instead of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, and also the thing they staged with Sascha Mariana Salzmann, the Tage jüdisch-muslimischer Leitkultur. So do you have any take on these forms of breaking up or reconfiguring memory cultures? You can pass too.
Personally, I love them. I mean, I'm very excited by a lot of this stuff. And I've been, I haven't been in Berlin. It's actually today is literally the 4th anniversary of our move from Berlin, where we'd spent the year, to Los Angeles. So it's been 4 years since I've been in Berlin. So I'm a little out of touch. But I've been reading Max Czolek's work and find it really quite productive. This notion of Gegenwartsbewältigung I like a lot. It was, I think, originally used by Daniel Kahn, who is another one of these Jews in Germany who doing exciting things, who I was thinking of, as well as Max Czolek. It was also used by my friend Deniz Utlu, who is a writer and human rights worker in Berlin, and has worked with Max Czolek as well. I think, to me, this is where a lot of the exciting stuff is happening right now. And I don't, not just with those individuals at all, but it's again, a piece of what I see as a set of exciting developments that I think are moving in different directions, that are not pious, I guess. There was this notion of Holocaust piety that Gillian Rose, I think, introduced some years ago, and I think that remains important, actually. I mean, there are other risks as well, of course, in going too far the other direction. But I think what I've found exciting in a lot of these collaborations between Jews and, say, post-migrants in Germany that I've witnessed in theater and music and other places in the last 20 years is a seriousness, but a lack of piety. And I think that's what leads to the creativity in many cases.
So now I want to hear Susan, who put her.
Pardon?
I saw you put your head in your hand, so I'm half hoping that we've managed to arrive at a point where you have some disagreement.
We finally disagree.
Okay.
Although I did not see the theater piece, so and I haven't read the second book, Gegenwartsbewältigung, because I was so disappointed by the first one. I am not the only person to point out that Czolek is writing as if it were in fact, what I said, some of these people are writing as if it was 1984. I was thinking of Max Czolek. And the whole notion of, Gedächtnistheater, he does credit, Mischa Bodemann, and that was in the early 90s. And I understand if you're 30 years old, I don't mean to sound condescending, I learn a lot from 30-year-olds, including my own, but if you're 30 and you have seen no arc of transformation that has taken place in the last 40 years of Germany, it's easy to make certain reproaches. And I'm all for seriousness without piety. That's a great notion. but I would also go for a little more historical awareness than and differentiation and nuance. I mean, I could write a book, by the way, if I wanted to, you know, about the anti-Semitism I have experienced in the last 20 years since I've been director of the Einstein Forum. That's before the whole thing with Weltoffenheit, which has really been fierce. And I can talk about hard anti-Semitism. I actually had a neo-Nazi neighbor who spent a long time trying to bash my door in. It was quite difficult and traumatic and required a trial and intervention of a leading politician to even, get it going. So I've dealt with hard anti-Semitism. I've dealt a zillion times with soft anti-Semitism, of which I could also name a number of examples. But I've also followed the trajectory that has been made in Germany since 1982. And I think it's really important. I mean, it's almost, no, you know what it's like? It's like people who say Black people are still being killed in the streets, and so Barack Obama's presidency doesn't matter at all. Now, those of us who volunteered for Barack Obama when he was running never thought it was going to usher in a post-racial era. We weren't that naive. But people who say that it didn't matter simply do not realize that none of us thought that would happen in our lifetimes. I mean, we would have been happy with a cabinet secretary, a Black cabinet secretary when I was growing up, and it didn't happen. And it changed things for people. It didn't fix things, but it changed things. And, again, my general view on progress, if you don't acknowledge the bits of progress that have been made, you're not going to have the will to make any more. So
it seems to me, I mean,
it looks like Michael is disagreeing with me now. So
do you want to respond briefly, Michael? We're coming up on the end of time.
Yeah, no, I realize that. And I mean, I don't want to debate Obama. I mean, I admire him and was deeply disappointed by him at the same time.
Sure.
I agree with you that we need to recognize moments of progress. I guess what I've come to think in the last 5 years or so, 6 years, whatever it is now, is that we really can't assume that this progress is linear in any way, and that we have to fight some of the same battles over and over again. And so what the progress that was made in the Obama years was lost, and then we went in the exact opposite direction. I think that's happening still. So we have to be dialectical, I guess, about what we see as advances and retreats. And more than anything, I think and I'm sure we agree on this, we have to just keep struggling to preserve those wins, and we need to expand them into new territories.
Absolutely. No disagreement there.
And it seems to me like it's very much a question. I mean, I'm fascinated by this discussion, which clearly could go on, and I hope it will in other forums and other places. But it seems very much a question of expanding the frames of reference. So, Susan, your point about expanding a frame of reference back to the 80s, historicizing, in other words, being, expansive historic, but also what we talked about earlier, expanding the provincializing frames, globalizing, dealing with the fact that memory is globalized and responding to it in kind in a certain way. So I'm really happy that we've managed to kind of do a tour of these kinds of reframings, which I think your work does incredibly well. And in order to underline that, I'm just going to quote one last entry in the Q&A, which is not a question, as Manuela Bauche from the Freie Universität Berlin says, not a question, but I just wanted to underline Michael Rothberg's observation and feeling that there are many people in Germany who are desperately looking for alternatives to narratives on the Holocaust as nationalistic and disciplining narratives, as well as looking for visions that go beyond the idea of victim competition. And she phrases this in response now to your book, Michael, but I want to expand it and say that I read both of your books in this way. In all my classes on Erinnerungskultur, I include a discussion of Michael's book, and this is always the session I'm looking forward to the most. I regularly feel the students' deep relief about the vision and empirical findings that multidirectional memory opens up, a deep gratitude for hinting at the fact that solidarities between those who look back on different histories of injustices are possible and real. And I think both of you enable us to look back in that way. And I'm very glad for your work and very glad for your presence today and your willingness to enter this discussion with us. And I look forward to continuing it in lots of different other places.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. And the only thing I regret is that it can't go on for longer, but we will definitely do this again in more than
Next year in Berlin. Next year in Berlin. That's my diasporic manifesto.
Wonderful.
I'm going to sign on to that as a goy. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.